Jason Schreier has done it again, this time in a gigantic Kotaku post in the BioWare studio over Anthem, and has interviewed 19 people who used to work there. This is a blog post about indecision and mismanagement, technical failings, and how a third, this time in a row, EA's Frostbite engine continues to harm the development of a project. Anthem, which has been in development for 7 years, only saw production in the last 18 months. Just like Andromeda. If you have the time, it's an interesting story of what happened between Dragon Age Inquisition, Andromeda, and finally Anthem. It explains why most people left, why big writers and developers left, and why the games are turning out bad. In this video, I'll list some of the highlights. Dozens of devs have left BioWare over the years over stress. Many say they or their coworkers had to take stress leave, a doctor-mandated period of weeks or even months worth of vacation for their mental health. One former BioWare developer told me they would frequently find a private room in the office, shut the door, and just cry. People were so angry and sad all the time, they said. Said another, depression and anxiety are an epidemic within BioWare. I actually cannot count the amount of stress casualties we had on Mass Effect Andromeda or Anthem, said a third former BioWare developer in an email. A stress casualty at BioWare means someone had such a mental breakdown from the stress, they're just gone for 1 to 3 months. Some come back, some don't. Average vacation for software devs in Canada can go anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. Sometimes it's cumulative based on your contract, so most people end up using it in December so they don't lose it. But 3 months to just quitting? I have never heard of that. Some of the people in Edmonton were so burnt out, said one former BioWare developer, they were like, we needed Dragon Age Inquisition to fail in order for people to realize that this isn't the right way to make games. There were experiments with procedural encounters where dynamic creatures and environmental hazards would spawn randomly from the world, but those weren't working too smoothly either. That took a long time, said one developer. The game was super reliant on this procedural system that just wasn't fun. You think this would have been a problem that Andromeda folks would have warned people about, but it's possible those people quit already? Regardless, it seems both teams came to the same conclusion. Procedural generated levels are a bad idea. In early 2015, David Gaider joined the writing team and changed stuff up. There were a lot of people who wanted to say over Anthem's story and kept articulating a desire to do something different without really being clear on what that was outside of it just not being anything BioWare had done before, which was apparently a bad thing. From my perspective, it was rather frustrating. Gaider left BioWare in early 2016. As time passed, I didn't feel keen to play the game that I was working on, he told me, which led to new writers for Anthem and a total story reboot. This led to even more chaos. As you can imagine, writing for BioWare sets the foundation for all the games, said one developer. When writing is unsure of what it's doing, it causes a lot of destruction to a lot of departments. When writers are leaving the game they're working on, you know something is going to go wrong. Creatively, for development, for management, who knows exactly what. But that is not a good sign. We knew they were leaving, we just never knew the exact reasons why. The root cause of all this was the lack of vision, said one former BioWare developer. What are we making? Please tell us. The recurring theme was there was no vision, there was no clarity, there was no single director saying, this is how it all works together. There was no producer on this game with a clear vision. The story and development pipeline wasn't even hammered out yet. And this is probably worse than scope creep. Scope creep is when features or changes to a software design are made outside the budget or the timeline. In this case, there is no written in stone basis for design. There's no solid design doc. So everyone's coming up with something and hoping everyone else agrees to it so it sticks. And then that becomes the base. Combined with playing with procedural generation, having an unsolidified story, and literally having flying be a feature and then removed, and then having it come back again, and doing this over and over for years. And you can begin to see just how messed up Anthem's development was. Throughout 2015 and 16, it appeared to the Anthem team that they were accomplishing very little. They struggled with the online infrastructure, they hadn't figured out how missions would work, and while they had built a few environments and creatures, it still wasn't clear exactly what the basic gameplay might look like. The story was changing constantly, and progress on the game grew sluggish. Frostbite is full of razor blades, one former BioWare employee told me a few weeks ago, aptly summing up the feelings of perhaps hundreds of game developers who have worked at Electronic Arts over the past few years. It often felt to the Anthem team like they were understaffed, according to that developer and others who worked on the game, many of whom told me their team was a fraction of the size of developers behind similar games like Destiny and The Division. There were a number of reasons for this. One was that in 2016, the FIFA games had to move to Frostbite. The annual soccer franchise was EA's most important series, bringing in a large chunk of the publisher's revenue, and BioWare had programmers with Frostbite experience, so Electronic Arts shifted them to FIFA. Thanks, EA. Really great to have an understaffed team suddenly work on your flagship soccer game. I'm not too sure how an engine designed to make Battlefield games has anything to do with making a sports game, but okay, sure. At E3 2017, BioWare announced that Anthem would launch in fall of 2018. Behind the scenes, however, they had barely even implemented a single mission. By the end of 2014, Shadow Realms, a multiplayer game called Saga, and a potential Knights of the Old Republic game were all cancelled, and BioWare had enacted an initiative that it called One BioWare, a plan designed to get all of the company studios working in tandem. They had been in idea land for 4 to 5 years, and nobody had actually gone, okay, we need to decide what we're making and make it, said one member of the team. They were still going back to the drawing board on major systems, which is fine. Part of game development is that you iterate, and that's like, this didn't work, let's go again. They never got to the point of like, this doesn't work, let's iterate on it. It was, this doesn't work, let's start from scratch. Starting from scratch after 3 years is not what you want to hear while in pre-production. That's during the first month or months of figuring stuff out and then determining what engine and tools would need to best facilitate your ideas. Not years later. The story was still in flux under new narrative director James Ohlen, who would also leave BioWare before Anthem shipped, and design was moving particularly slowly with systems like mission structure, loot, and exosuit powers still not finalized. A number of veteran BioWare developers began leaving the studio that summer, and the untimely death of Corey Gasper, one of the game's lead designers, left a massive hole in that department. Core features like loading and saving still hadn't been implemented in the game, and it became difficult to play test builds because they were riddled with bugs. James Ohlen was at BioWare for 22 years as creative director and lead designer on every franchise they had. This was a big deal. Anthem was on fire, and by October of 2017, BioWare had decided to make some massive changes. That summer, studio general manager Aaron Flynn departed to be replaced by returning Casey Hudson. As part of this process, the studio canceled Joplin, which was Dragon Age 4. Laidlaw quit shortly afterward, and BioWare restarted Dragon Age 4 with a tiny team under the codename Morrison. Meanwhile, the studio moved the bulk of Dragon Age 4's development to Anthem, which needed all of the company's resources if it was going to hit the ship date that EA was demanding. This is why Mike Laidlaw quit. The creative director who has been with Dragon Age since the beginning. He was just being polite. But if your project is canceled after years of design work, and then rebooted right after, you might be a bit angry. Mark Darrah was then installed over game director John Warner to become executive producer on Anthem. His role became so significant that he took top billing in Anthem's credits. That the first name in Anthem's credits is someone who started working on the game in October of 2017, just 16 months before it shipped, says volumes about its development. Oh yeah, Mark Darrah. Just like Andromeda, he's the Mac Walters of Anthem. By the beginning of 2018, by another former developer's recollection, Anthem's progress was so far behind that they'd only implemented a single mission. Most of the high-level design had still not been finalized, like the loot system and javelin powers, and the writing was still very much in flux. They talk a lot about the 6-year development time, but really the core gameplay loop, the story, and all the missions in the game were made in the last 12 to 16 months, because of that lack of vision and total lack of leadership across the board, said the developer. I don't know how accurate this is, said one BioWare developer, but it felt like the entire game was basically built in the last 6 to 9 months. You couldn't play it. There was nothing there. It was just this crazy final rush. The hard part is, how do you make a decision when there's no game? There's nothing to play. So yeah, you're going to keep questioning yourself. Wow, doesn't that sound familiar? How could you tell if the loot drop rates were balanced when you couldn't even play through the whole game? How could you assess whether the game felt grindy or repetitive when the story wasn't even finished yet? We hear about the big people, said another developer who left. When writer Drew Karpathian leaves, it makes big waves. But a lot of people don't realize that there were a ton of really talented game designers who left BioWare and no one knows. The general public is unaware of who these people are. Some of those people took off for other cities, while over a dozen followed former BioWare boss Aaron Flynn to Improbable, a technology company that recently announced plans to develop its own game. That list includes many former high-level staff, including art and animation director Neil Thompson, technical director Jacques Lebrun, and lead designer Chris Schoenberg. some of whom were at BioWare for over a decade. Game development should be a hard and fulfilling job, full of stress but full of desirable overtime and accomplishments. People want to know what they're working on, and what they're doing actually has meaning. And if you take that away, things break down. This illuminates some of the questions and concerns we've had with BioWare over the years. They have designs that can't be fulfilled and no clear direction of what a project is supposed to be. They spend years trying and failing to implement ideas like procedural generation and ultimately just scrap it. People leave and creative vision goes out the door. There seems to be no solid development pipeline. Without a solid design, there's no fundamental method of building or fixing the project. You have to reinvent the wheel or just get a prototype ready and that hopefully someone will approve because the design is up in the air. This explains why so many bugs start popping up on patches, as no one knows how to fix problems without breaking something else. Another observable problem is the infighting between studios. Even with only 2 left, it seems Edmonton is still superior and Austin is always second tier. Combined with a ridiculous crunch time, people are getting overly stressed and angry on a project they can't believe in because they don't know what they're making. And lastly, technical problems, notably with Frostbite. It's just not working. This engine is not suited. Go back to Unreal and go back to single-player RPGs, because if you don't, BioWare's going to die. You can argue with EA, do whatever it takes, but whatever it is, it's just not working. Within minutes of this posting on Kotaku going live today, BioWare made a response on their blog, obviously defending themselves, trying to be positive, and again, learning nothing. You can go check that out too if you like, but ultimately, these are my feelings on the matter.
That's arrogant presumption.
My father requested that I open
I
negotiations.
know your father's the Vulcan ambassador, for heaven's sake. But you know how I feel about this. They're animals, Jim.
There is an historic opportunity here.
Don't believe them. Don't trust them.
They are dying.
Let them die.